They say if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the bells, faint, metallic, a sound that doesn't echo, but lingers, not from a church above, but from the earth below. Buried in the Oregon wilderness is a place that was never holy, only sanctified by blood. This is not a ghost story. This is a blueprint, a design, a method. One that the world politely forgot, because it understood what the truth would cost. In the 19th century, as thousands clawed their way westward, chasing promises of gold, freedom, and land, a new predator emerged. Not with fangs or rifles, but with scripture, soft hands, and the smile of salvation. The Grayson family didn't kill in rage. They didn't slaughter in haste. They performed it, rehearsed it, honed it like a sacred ritual, and they did it under the sign of the cross. Father Moriah Grayson wasn't just a man of God. He was a master of spiritual warfare. His weapons weren't visible. They were psychological, scriptural, surgical. With a single verse, he could make a dying father feel chosen. With a funeral hymn, he could bury a secret so deep no lawman would ever find it. But this story, it wasn't his alone. There was Sister Constance, his wife in doctrine, his instrument in silence. Her poisons didn't just kill, they cleansed, slowly, deliberately. And then came Brother Ezekiel, the hands, the fixer, the cleaner. He who made sure no trace remained but sanctified ash and carefully disturbed soil. The Grayson family chapel wasn't a place of worship, it was a processing facility, a terminal stop on the Oregon Trail disguised in holy garb. To the desperate, it was divine intervention. To the dying, it was hospice. But to the Graysons, it was a ledger, a transaction, a calculation of value. Human lives measured in coins, jewelry, and the haunting silence that followed their burial. Understand this. What you're about to hear is not just history, it's design. It's a reminder that institutions don't need guns when they have your faith. So stay with me and listen closely, because once you hear the whole truth, you'll never look at charity or churches in the same way again. By the spring of 1852, the Grayson family had constructed more than just a chapel. They had established an ecosystem of control. To the common settler, the Sacred Heart Chapel appeared humble, even fragile against the vast Oregon wilderness. But that fragility was a mask, a psychological weapon. The building's wooden facade, weathered from storms and wind, whispered of piety and sacrifice. Yet every board nailed into place, every stone buried beneath its foundation, was part of a machine, a ritualized structure of death. Father Moriah understood something few men ever do. True power does not come from force, but from trust. And in a time when the average traveler had lost everything, home, comfort, kin, they were not looking for weapons or gold. They were looking for someone to believe in, someone who spoke of eternity while offering bread and water. That is where the Graysons thrived. They positioned themselves at the intersection of exhaustion and hope, where logic begins to fracture and fear makes faith irresistible. It was Sister Constance who played the part of the healer, her voice low, her touch cold and practiced. She understood herbs, yes, but more than that, she understood the psychology of suffering. She didn't just give medicine, she gave performance. She administered her poisons while humming hymns, mixing scripture with slow-acting death, and always under the guise of divine mercy. Brother Ezekiel, he was less refined, but no less essential. He was the shadow that made the chapel feel safe. He repaired wagons with suspicious efficiency, always showing up moments after tragedy. The families believed it was providence. In truth, it was pattern. They were being watched long before they ever saw the steeple, and when the wagon axle snapped or a child began to cough, the Graysons were already waiting. Each new arrival was handled like a business acquise. Moriah assessed the family's psychology. Constance judged their physical resilience. Ezekiel calculated the inventory. From there, the process began, a slow, sanctified descent into death. The Graysons didn't just murder, they erased. And what's worse, they convinced their victims that they were being saved. That is the kind of evil the world cannot forgive, because it's the kind that hides in plain sight, wrapped in scripture, dressed in white linen, whispering, "This is God's will." It was September 23rd, 1852, when the Morrison family wandered into the snare. James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, and her aging father were not naive. They were simply exhausted. After months on the trail, chasing a future promised by land brokers and mapmakers, their hope had been whittled down to survival. When the wagon axle splintered near the Grayson property, James called it divine intervention. That was his first mistake. Within hours, Brother Ezekiel arrived, not sweating, not panting, just there, as if summoned by the moment. He offered help with the calm assurance of a man used to being trusted, and they trusted him. Why wouldn't they? His hands were calloused, his speech deliberate. He said God had led them to Sacred Heart Chapel, a place where travelers found rest, medicine, and mercy. By dusk, the Morrisons were guests in the Graysons' world. Their fate sealed the moment they crossed the chapel's threshold. Over the next 3 days, everything felt holy. Sister Constance tended to Elizabeth like a midwife sent from heaven, mixing teas from her cabinet of labeled jars. The children played under the watchful eye of Ezekiel. Father Morai sat with James in evening prayer, quoting verses that seemed tailored to his soul's fatigue. There was no rush, no fear, just warmth, just the sense that someone finally cared. That's how they worked, not with knives, but with patience. The killings didn't start with violence. They began with comfort. Then, Elizabeth's father fell sick. Nausea, cramps, short breath. Sister Constance explained it away as trail sickness, a common affliction. She prepared a new remedy, thicker, more bitter. Samuel's condition worsened. Within 2 days he was gone. They prayed over his body while the children looked on, quiet and confused. No one suspected murder. No one imagined poison, because when a death is wrapped in ritual, it stops feeling like murder. It feels like fate, a holy tragedy. By the time young Tommy and Mary began showing symptoms, it was too late. James prayed harder. Elizabeth wept more. And Constance, with her ever-gentle hands, brought more remedies from below. The poison was working, not just in their bodies, but in their minds. And the Graysons smiled behind every whispered psalm. On the 6th day, the chapel began to change. Not its walls, but its meaning. For James Morrison, the once welcoming structure now felt like a tomb made of scripture and sorrow. Young Tommy, once full of chatter, now lay in the corner of the chapel's guest cabin, whispering words no one could understand, his skin pale, lips cracked. Mary followed close behind, vomiting blood into a tin bucket while Sister Constance prayed over her, eyes closed, hands steady. It all seemed so spiritual, so serene, but James had begun to see something else, a rhythm behind the chaos, a pattern masked as providence. He asked to leave. Morai placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and spoke like a man reciting prophecy, not opinion. "Brother James," he said, "moving now would be abandoning their souls to chaos. The Lord tests the faithful in storms. You must remain within his will." James didn't protest. That was his second mistake. The next morning, he was sick. The same symptoms, the same pattern. That's when Elizabeth began to panic. She asked for outside help, begged them to fetch someone from the trading post 15 miles east. Morai shook his head. "To leave is to doubt the Lord's design," he warned. "And doubt invites judgment." Then came the line, the one investigators would quote years later in horror. "Sister Constance is not just a healer," Morai said. "She is an instrument. Through her hands, the Lord both purifies and selects." By now, the poison had infected every part of the Morrison family, body, mind, spirit. James, bloated and delirious, muttered hymns in broken rhythm. Elizabeth, 8 months pregnant and frantic, tried to hide what little strength she had left. But there was no escape, not from this place, not from these people. On the 14th day, James died, eyes open, mouth frozen mid-prayer. Elizabeth went into labor hours later. The child was born pale, unmoving, baptized by Morai with water and a whisper, returned to the Creator. 3 days later, Elizabeth herself succumbed, her body buried beneath the chapel's rear grove, marked with a small wooden cross. And just like that, 6 lives vanished, but not lost. The Graysons remembered everything, the dates, the items, the gold coins hidden in James's coat lining. Nothing was forgotten. Because this wasn't madness. It was order. The Morrison deaths were not an aberration. They were a prototype, a proof of concept wrapped in hymns and funerary rites. And they worked, so efficiently in fact that Morai Grayson began keeping notes. Not sermons, not prayers, ledgers. He wrote down dates, dosages, belongings recovered, and the spiritual justifications that proved most convincing. These were not confessions. They were formulas, recipes for perfected murder. The entries were written with the precision of a banker, not a butcher. Subject: Morrison. Outcome: complete. Method: arsenic via infusion. Timeline: 17 days. Emotional resistance: low. Profit: high. And beneath it, scrawled in a firmer hand, faith remains the optimal delivery mechanism. That was the revelation that changed everything. Not that people could be killed, but that they could be persuaded to accept their death, even welcome it, if it was dressed in ritual and righteousness. The Graysons didn't see themselves as killers, they saw themselves as refiners. Separators of the strong from the weak, instruments of judgment disguised as caretakers. Their theology was quiet but lethal. Suffering, they taught, was redemptive. Death, a passage to purity. Poverty, a test of soul. To die in their arms was not murder, it was sanctification. With this new framework, they built a method. Ezekiel's role expanded, no longer just a fixer, he became a scout. He would ride out in advance, looking for vulnerable families, ones traveling alone, struggling with illness, or bearing signs of wealth poorly concealed. He took mental notes, the quality of their wagons, the state of their supplies, the health of their children. When he found a match, he didn't act immediately. He waited, he watched, he studied, and when the moment was right, a broken wheel, a sick child, a wrong turn, he arrived with a smile and an open hand. Back at the chapel, cons. Tance began refining her tinctures. She experimented with subtle changes in dosage, slower kills for cautious families, quicker ones for those less observant. Her craft was quiet, like embroidery, precise, undetectable, and Morai? He perfected the psychology. He learned to read a man's denomination from the first 3 words out of his mouth, and he adjusted accordingly, quoting Baptist fire to some, Calvinist destiny to others. Every soul, every family became a case study, not in faith, in submission, because that was the goal, not just death, but obedience until the final breath. By the spring of 1853, the Graysons were no longer experimenting, they were executing. Their second family, the Hoffmans, arrived as if summoned by the darkness itself. German immigrants with 3 children and a wagon heavy with tools, textiles, and gold coins sewn into garments, they were ideal prey. Isolated, wealthy, and naive. Their English was broken, their faith strong, and their customs foreign enough to make them easy to mislead and isolate. Ezekiel spotted them 2 days before they reached the chapel. He watched from a ridge as their wagon broke rhythm crossing a narrow creek bed. The left rear wheel wobbled, a perfect opportunity. He waited until dusk before riding in with a calm greeting and gentle warning about fever cases nearby and a safe place of healing just a few miles ahead. By the time they arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, Sister Constance already had her tinctures prepared. She didn't wait for illness this time. She began small, administering what she called preventive tonics to ward off trail fever. They were given in communion cups, always with a prayer, and always with the words, "The Lord heals through submission." Within days, the youngest child began vomiting, then the mother. By the second week, 2 of the children were dead. Father Moray conducted the burials with such emotional weight that even the grieving father, Heinrich Hoffmann, seemed to believe the deaths had been sacred, not suspicious. Sometimes, Moray whispered as they lowered the child's body into the dirt, God calls the youngest home first. They are too pure for this world. The grief blinded them, and the sickness masked the crime. Sister Constance increased the doses. The mother's face turned ashen. The father began coughing blood. Still, they stayed, because where else would they go? They were strangers in a foreign land, bound by fear, trapped by hospitality, wit. In 4 weeks, the entire Hoffmann family had perished. Their tools were disassembled and sold off in pieces, their gold melted down and scattered across 3 settlements. The Graysons even kept some of the finer garments, claiming them as donations. To the outside world, it appeared as another trail tragedy, but to Moray, it was a perfect operation, and to those reading this now, it was the moment when kindness itself became a weapon, a smiling executioner clothed in gospel. With the Hoffmanns buried and their belongings catalogued, the Graysons had crossed a threshold, no longer opportunists cloaked in scripture, but architects of death with a holy blueprint. Each season on the Oregon Trail brought fresh waves of families too desperate to be careful, too devout to be suspicious, and the Graysons now knew exactly how to select, isolate, and eliminate with ritualistic precision. They began tracking the calendar like farmers counting harvests, only instead of crops, they measured grief. The spring of 1853 had yielded 2 full families. By summer, they aimed higher. That's when the Weatherbys arrived. Charles Weatherby, a former Confederate officer from Tennessee, brought with him his wife Margaret, their twin daughters, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith hauling thousands in equipment. Unlike previous victims, Charles was alert, suspicious, a soldier's eyes. When Ezekiel approached them after a wagon wheel cracked 6 miles from the chapel, Charles declined assistance. He'd heard rumors, vague, broken stories of families who'd vanished after accepting kindness in isolated regions. That paranoia made him dangerous, but danger, Moray believed, could be managed through psychology. So they adapted. Instead of pressing, Moray retreated. He let time do the work. A passing mention of cholera, a word of caution about regional sickness. That's all it took to seed doubt in Margaret's already exhausted mind. When David developed a mild fever 2 days later, a fever caused in truth by Sister Constance's low-dose preventative teas, the family's resistance broke. They accepted temporary shelter. That was all the Graysons needed. Yet Charles remained watchful. He inspected the chapel, asked about other travelers, studied their movements. Moray countered with flattery and false humility, saying things like, "A man with your bearing would see danger where others sleep." Charles took the bait. He liked being seen. He liked control, and slowly that pride was weaponized against him. Meanwhile, Constance adjusted her dosage schedule. Slow poison for David, accelerated doses for the daughters, a separate herbal blend for Margaret, crafted to simulate uterine bleeding and extreme fatigue. The goal wasn't just death, it was distraction, isolation. Fracture the family from within, let their own trauma blind them to the pattern, and always, always speak in scripture. Because when people believe God is testing them, they stop questioning the ones holding the knife. Charles Weatherby's military instincts were sharp, but even sharp eyes grow heavy under grief. By the 2nd week, the twins were dead, Sarah first, then Susan, both buried with solemn hymns under crosses Charles helped carve with his own hands. He was told it was typhoid, trail fever, God's mysterious judgment, but he couldn't explain why their symptoms mirrored each other so precisely, or why Sister Constance always administered tea just before they worsened. Still, grief dulls logic, and the girls' deaths broke Margaret in ways words cannot reach. She wept for hours, barely ate, barely spoke, and when she bled heavily the following morning, she believed it was the strain of loss, not poison laced into the tinctures of comforting root. That was the genius of the Graysons. They didn't fight resistance, they let it rot from the inside. Constance encouraged Margaret to rest. "The Lord gives and takes," she whispered. "Let yourself be taken care of." Meanwhile, David's fever escalated. By day 17, his breathing was shallow, his fingertips blue. Charles finally demanded they leave. "We need real help," he said. "From a doctor, from anyone else." Morai nodded solemnly, then spoke with a gravity that could silence thunder. "Brother Charles," he said, "you are a man of valor, but valor must bow to divine timing. If you move David now, his blood will be on your hands. Would you gamble your wife's soul, your brother's life, your own peace, just to run from a trial the Lord has given?" It was brilliant. Accusation veiled as guidance, manipulation baptized as moral duty. Charles hesitated, and that hesitation sealed him. David died the next day. Margaret followed 2 nights later, moaning into the dark, whispering to daughters that could no longer answer. Charles, surrounded by death and driven mad with helplessness, accepted final communion from Morai's hand. It was wine mare, mixed with arsenic. The sacred made fatal. Within hours he collapsed in the chapel pews, calling out his wife's name. No one answered. The last sounds he heard were Ezekiel shoveling graves in the grove, and Sister Constance humming a lullaby. The Weatherby family, like the Morrisons, like the Hoffmans, vanished into the soil, and the Graysons, they documented every detail. Dates, symptoms, mistakes, profit. Not one tear was shed, because for them, this was not loss. This was refinement, precision, evolution. By the end of 1854, the Graysons were no longer simply murdering, they were curating. Each victim, each family was no longer just a target, but a data point in their expanding theology of control. The murders had taken on a rhythm, seasonal, methodical, like planting and harvesting. But unlike crops, what they cultivated was obedience, and what they reaped was silence. They refined every aspect of their enterprise, from the dosage levels of poison to the timing of spiritual manipulation. They mapped emotional trajectories like topographers. Grief peaks on day 3, fatigue lowers resistance by day 6, and the introduction of spiritual guilt increases compliance by day 9. It was no longer enough to simply kill. The Graysons wanted surrender. They wanted each soul to walk willingly into the grave with folded hands and whispered prayers. In the quiet of the chapel basement, Morai began drafting a new document, not a ledger this time, but what he called the doctrine of sacred transition. It was part theology, part operations manual, and entirely monstrous. It outlined the steps required to break a family, isolate them, offer relief, introduce ritual, apply spiritual pressure, and remove options until submission becomes inevitable. Despair, Morai wrote, is the doorway through which the soul accepts obedience. Constance added her own notes, focusing on the body. Which herbs masked arsenic best? Which symptoms invited the least suspicion? How to bleed a woman slowly enough to mimic miscarriage. She wasn't just a poisoner. She was an artisan of affliction. Ezekiel's role expanded too. He started intercepting mail carriers, removing letters that might alert distant relatives. He learned to mimic handwriting and composed forged notes telling families back east that all is well, buying the Graysons weeks, sometimes months, of delay. Their crimes stretched Bayosong on death now. They became ghost makers, erasers of legacy, dissolving bloodlines into unmarked graves. And yet the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Pioneers still trudged westward, still broke wheels, still prayed for miracles. And when they arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons were waiting, smiles polished, Bibles open, poison measured. No suspicion, no resistance, just gratitude, because by now the Graysons had become more than murderers. They were gods in that stretch of wilderness. Merciful, patient, and utterly merciless. By 1855, the killings were no longer concealed within necessity. They had become ceremony. The Graysons had evolved from opportunists into curators of death, and their crimes were no longer simply hidden. They were sanctified. Each act of murder followed a rigid, almost liturgical pattern. Confession, communion, affliction, burial. Victims weren't just poisoned, they were ushered into death like lambs to altar, with prayer, song, and scripture to guide their descent. Father Morai began referring to their ritualized process as the passing. In his personal writings, he claimed that the Trail families were transitory vessels of corrupted ambition, that God himself had chosen the Graysons to cleanse the land of those unworthy to inherit it. He believed, or convinced himself to believe, that this was divine stewardship, not slaughter. It was genocide baptized in gospel. Sister Constance took on the role of spiritual midwife, her presence so comforting that mothers dying in agony would thank her between spasms of vomit and blood. She would whisper in their ears as they passed, "Let go, the Lord is ready to receive you." Her touch was soft, her tonics lethal, her lies perfect. Ezekiel, once just a simple farm boy, now embraced the gravekeeper's role with pride. He mapped burial plots with mathematical precision, marked trees in coded notches, and kept records so detailed that it bordered on obsession. 3 graves, North Grove, near Split Birch. Adult male, 2 children. Items, silver comb, leather ledger, 10 coins. Cause, arsenic wine, 12-day timeline. These were not mere entries. They were scripture to him, the sacred history of his family's dark ascension. And the basement? It had changed. No longer just a storage room, it had become a cathedral of secrets. Barrels of wine laced with death, jars of labeled herbs, forged letters stacked in alphabetical order, and beneath a floorboard near the altar, a hidden drawer lined with pages, confessions written by victims too delirious to realize what they were signing. Morai would read them at night, holding a lantern in the dark, murmuring their words like psalms. "Forgive me, Lord, I failed as a father. Protect my daughter. I trust you." It was the perfect irony. The dying gave their faith freely, and the Graysons, devils in clerical garb, returned it as poison. What truly shielded the Graysons from discovery wasn't their isolation, it was their alignment with the symbols of trust. In a lawless frontier where illness was common and hope was rare, the presence of a chapel, a preacher, and a healing woman felt like divine providence. People wanted to believe, and that need for belief made them blind. Word spread along the trail of the sacred sanctuary in the Oregon wilderness, where Christian charity still lived, where broken families found shelter, and where burials were offered free of charge to the bereaved. No one questioned why every grave bore the same style of cross. No one asked why there were no survivors to give thanks. The few who did reach the next outpost after encountering the Graysons often did so with foggy memories, delirious from illness or weary from trauma, if they made it at all. And even when doubts were raised, nothing stuck. There was no sheriff to investigate, no town hall to report to. The nearest formal authority was over 30 miles away, and even then, who would accuse a preacher of murder? Especially one with letters of gratitude, scriptures at the ready, and a graveyard full of neatly arranged stones. Morai understood that his collar was armor. That suspicion dies where sanctimony begins. He courted the traveling clergy, visiting circuit preachers who moved between settlements, showing them around the chapel, offering tithes, quoting scripture. They saw what they wanted to see, a man of God sacrificing comfort to minister to the forgotten. And when those same preachers later heard rumors of disappearances, they defended the Graysons with vehemence. "Impossible," they said. "That man lives like a monk." What none of them realized was that the Graysons had begun controlling not just death, but narrative. Every lie was rehearsed, every false account meticulously constructed. Letters from survivors were mailed east through intermediaries who thought they were helping illiterate travelers. In time, entire families were written out of history, not just murdered, but erased. To question the Graysons became, in the eyes of some, an act of blasphemy. Because that's what happens when evil wears the robes of virtue. It doesn't just escape justice, it becomes immune to it. And so the killing continued, uninterrupted, sanctified, and ever more efficient. By the spring of 1856, the Graysons no longer viewed their murders as crimes, but as rites, spiritual exchanges in which suffering was currency and silence the sacrament. Morai began preaching to the dead. After each burial he would stand above the fresh soil and deliver full sermons, part benediction, part justification. He spoke of divine selection, of the righteous being chosen to carry the burden of death so others could live. "We are the stewards," he wrote in one of his journals. "We cleanse the road to Eden with necessary sorrow." These were not the delusions of a madman, but the doctrine of a man who believed himself chosen. What terrified investigators years later wasn't how easily the Graysons killed, but how deeply they believed in the righteousness of their acts. They saw themselves not as executioners, but as shepherds. Constance began recording names in a leather-bound volume titled The Book of Passage. Each entry was written as if the victim had been a pilgrim voluntarily departing this world for the next. Eleanor Barnes, received into peace 10 days' journey, purified through suffering. The language was ceremonial, as if death itself had become a kind of baptism. But underneath the religious euphemisms lay something far more strategic. Control. Absolute psychological control. The Graysons didn't just poison the body, they rewired the victim's reality. By the time a father watched his daughter cough blood into a cloth, he had already accepted the narrative. This was God's will. By the time a mother laid her infant in the chapel's cradle and whispered goodbye, she believed she was offering the child to heaven, not to murderers. And when the final moments came, when the poison overtook the heart, the mind clung to Scripture. That was the brilliance. That was the horror. The victims went willingly. The trail, meanwhile, continued. More settlers came, drawn by the promise of land and the illusion of manifest destiny. They carried their children, their savings, their hopes, all toward the killing ground in eastern Oregon. And the Graysons waited. They improved their methods, sharpened their rituals, and expanded the basement. It now held not just supplies and journals, but racks of clothing, shelves of heirlooms, and crates of jewelry, relics of the forgotten, offerings to their dark ministry. This wasn't murder, this was liturgy. By 1858, the killings had become inheritance. What began as murder disguised as mercy evolved into a family creed, passed down like sacred scripture. The Graysons no longer operated in secrecy, they operated in tradition. Each act was ritualized, each deception refined, and each death recorded not in shame, but pride. A new generation had begun to emerge within the walls of the Sacred Heart Chapel. The Graysons had children, 2 sons born of Morai and Constance, raised not with lullabies and fairy tales, but with silence, scripture, and shadows. They learned to speak from the dead, not of them. Their lullabies were sermons, their games involved grave marking and potion mixing. The older boy, Caleb, had the calm intensity of his father. He watched with predatory stillness, asking few questions but memorizing everything. The younger, Jonah, took after Constance, curious, precise, and eerily gentle with the dying. By age 10 they were fluent in false testimony and knew how to measure arsenic doses by weight, not guesswork. They were never told the full truth, not at once, but they were shaped by it. Morai believed knowledge was to be earned, not given. Each year brought new layers of revelation. One night Caleb asked his father why certain graves had no names. Morai smiled and replied, "Because heaven knows them already." The boy accepted it and never asked again. And this is how generational evil takes root, not with violence, but with belief. The children didn't rebel, they didn't weep, they obeyed. By now, Sacred Heart was more than a chapel. It was a sovereign estate. They had extended underground chambers. Constance began keeping records of medicinal experiments, noting how different tinctures affected children versus the elderly. Ezekiel trained the boys in carpentry and livestock management, but always with a watchful eye, teaching them how to speak to traders without revealing too much, how to sell heirlooms without triggering suspicion. Even their prayers became darker. At night, Morai would gather them for what he called the vigil of the departed. They'd sit by candlelight, reciting names of those who had crossed over that season, not mourning them, but honoring the system. The chapel was no longer just a trap for travelers. It had become a temple of bloodline. The Graysons weren't hiding. They were planting something permanent. By the early 1860s, the Graysons had begun reaching beyond the trail. Isolation had once been their shield, but now it became their prison. Morai, ever the strategist, understood that true power wasn't just in secrecy, it was in integration. To survive the changing frontier, they had to evolve from predators into pillars, so the Graysons began inserting themselves into the growing communities east and west of the chapel. It started with simple gestures, donations to new churches being built in nearby settlements, modest financial gifts to schoolhouses, orphanages, and lawmen's widows, not large enough to draw suspicion, just enough to earn favor. Morai would ride out on Sundays, dressed in clerical black, offering guest sermons at frontier congregations. His words were soft, measured, biblical. But laced beneath each parable was a whisper of control. He spoke of obedience, of sacrifice, of the chosen few who must carry the weight of sin for the many. People listened, and more than a few men in power found themselves drawn to him, not because they knew the truth, but because power recognizes power. He had the look of a man who understood things they did not. By 1862, Morai had forged discreet alliances with traders, postal carriers, and even a county magistrate. Most never knew what he truly was. They just believed him to be a generous man of God who ran a distant chapel with orphan children and a charitable wife. It was the perfect mask. Constance began cultivating herbal treatments and sending them to nearby towns under the guise of frontier medicine. The mixtures were safe, but it allowed her to collect information. Requests for more remedies became coded letters. Families asking for cleansing tea were marked as vulnerable. Meanwhile, Caleb and Jonah, now teenagers, were sent on their own missions. They traveled as helpers, apprentices, young missionaries assisting the turns. Their father's work. In truth, they were scouts, spreading influence, studying patterns, and learning how to spot cracks in the armor of strangers. The chapel was no longer the whole system, it was the root. The tree had begun to grow outward. The Graysons weren't just murdering now, they were embedding, building a legacy that would outlive their flesh. The killing would continue, but now it would wear a smile, carry scripture, and shake your hand before it bled you dry. By 1864, the Graysons had perfected something far more dangerous than arsenic: ideology. Their victims no longer died simply from poison, they died believing it was righteous. The real weapon wasn't the medicine, it was the message. Morai had begun refining a theology that justified everything. He called it the doctrine of cleansing, a twisted gospel that painted death as divine filtration. He preached it only in private, within the chapel's darkened walls, to his family and select outsiders who had proven their usefulness. According to this doctrine, the frontier was God's crucible, a place of judgment, and only the spiritually pure would survive. The weak, the sick, the unworthy were to be released from their suffering by those chosen to bear that sacred burden. "We are the hands of heaven's hygiene," Morai would say to his sons, "not killers, but cleaners." Caleb absorbed the message with the quiet fanaticism of a true heir. Jonah, though more sensitive, followed with equal loyalty, finding comfort in the order of their rituals. What began as practical murder had become moral architecture. They didn't just end lives, they shaped meaning. And for men seeking certainty in a chaotic world, Morai's creed offered something intoxicating, a sense of divine purpose. Some who passed through Sacred Heart didn't die. A few, young, male, directionless, were recruited, given new clothes, new names, a role in the ministry, and a chance to belong to something larger than themselves. These were the lambs, wanderers who had survived loss, war, or destitution, and were molded into loyal servants through confession, fasting, and indoctrination. They dug graves, mixed tonics, studied Morai's scripture, and never questioned, because they were given what every broken man craves: identity. By the end of 1865, the Graysons had built an inner circle, a hierarchy, not just a family but a church, one founded on blood, silence, and absolute obedience. They had sermons, codes, even a sacred text, handwritten volumes that mixed biblical verses with Morai's apocalyptic commentary. To the outside world, Sacred Heart remained a quaint stop along the trail, a place of prayer. But inside, it had become a psychological engine, every prayer a test, every death a sacrament, and every convert a weapon, loyal, unseen, and unbreakable. The poison had moved beyond the body. It now lived in the soul. By the fall of 1866, the Graysons were no longer content with the slow drip of victims along the Oregon Trail. Their hunger had grown, and so had their vision. Morai believed that if a doctrine was true, it must spread, not by fire or sword, but by silence and suggestion, truth whispered rather than shouted. That year marked the first known external operation, a quiet test of their reach. Caleb, now 19, was sent east under the name Elijah Moore. His mission was not to kill, but to observe, to embed. He posed as a theology student, enrolling at a modest seminary in Idaho Territory. He carried no weapons, just a copy of Morai's handwritten doctrine and a set of forged letters, naming him as an orphan sponsored by a religious benefactor. No one questioned him. He was quiet, intelligent, devout. Over the next 6 months, Caleb began to infiltrate. He volunteered at funerals, assisted in clinics, befriended a local pastor, and joined small prayer circles where vulnerable men gathered to speak of sin, fear, and loss. It was there he tested phrases, subtle injections of the Grayson doctrine. What if suffering is a filter, he'd ask? What if death is God's refinement, not punishment? He wasn't preaching, he was planting, watching who responded, who leaned forward, who nodded. One man in particular, a young physician's assistant named Robert Dane, proved susceptible. Recently widowed, spiritually unmoored, and desperate for order, he began requesting more time with Caleb. Within weeks, Robert was quoting Morai's language without knowing it. "Some men," he said once during a prayer meeting, "are born to carry the weight others can't." Caleb returned to Sacred Heart in the spring of 1867 with more than just field notes. He returned with a blueprint, a method, a model for expansion that didn't require violence, only hunger, emotional hunger, psychological exposure, the kind the war had made men long for something to obey. Morai was elated. The operation had proven his theory. Their doctrine could live in others, could reproduce, could spread without blood, and yet blood would still be required, for cleansing, for proof, for legacy. So while Caleb prepared for his next mission, Jonah took on more responsibilities at the chapel. The machine was growing, not just in death toll, but in reach. The first seed had been planted beyond Oregon, and it had taken root. By 1868, Morai Grayson no longer saw himself as a mere preacher or provider of death. He saw himself as an architect, not of buildings but of systems, and every system, he believed, required 3 things: a doctrine, a hierarchy, and a distribution model. Sacred Heart had long functioned as the nucleus, but now Morai began building what he called the outer lattice, a quiet web of influence stretching far beyond the hills of Oregon. His sons were his apostles. Caleb had proven himself a skilled missionary, not of salvation, but of psychological conversion. Jonah, though less comfortable beyond the chapel, possessed an innate gift for organization. So Morai assigned him a different role, internal codification. Jonah was to take the disjointed writings of his father and organize them into structured texts. By winter, the first book was complete, the Manual of Refinement. It outlined the doctrine, rituals, and symbols of what was now referred to as the Order. It was never printed, only hand-copied in a select number of volumes, each one marked with a sigil resembling a cross with a broken halo. Meanwhile, Morai began identifying nodes, men of influence across neighboring counties who were either corruptible, desperate, or already spiritually fractured. These men weren't told the full truth, they were simply nudged. A well-timed donation, a sympathetic letter, a visitor from Sacred Heart who offered solutions to problems no one else could fix. A sheriff with a drinking problem was offered a tonic. A banker who'd lost a child received a letter from a friend who had known similar sorrow. These touches seemed benign, but each was a thread, and soon those threads became leashes. The Graysons weren't expanding through domination, they were expanding through dependence. Each node served a function: silence, shelter, supply, or surveillance. Some passed along information about suspicious families on the trail. Others purchased goods without asking questions. A few even performed burials for families that never officially arrived. By the end of 1868, Marai estimated they had 23 active nodes across 4 territories. None knew the full map, only Marai. That was the brilliance. No one man could collapse the system. And so the chapel, once just a trap in the hills, had become the beating heart of an invisible structure. A shadow church, a theology of murder, a network of silence. As the order grew, Morai realized that influence without filtration would lead to collapse. Not every man could carry the weight of hidden truth. Some broke, some confessed, some simply didn't have the stomach to do what was required. So in early 1869, the Graysons implemented what they called the Trial of 3 Days, a ritualized test of loyalty, obedience, and spiritual endurance. Every new lamb, before receiving full inclusion into the order, was required to pass through this silent crucible. It was never explained in advance. That was the point. The trial began without warning. A lamb would be taken to the lower chamber of the chapel basement, a lightless space lined with stone and scripture. There he would remain for 72 hours. No food, no water, no speech, only darkness and scripture whispered through slits in the walls. He who clings to self shall be broken. To purge the weak is to serve the strong. God refines his vessels with flame and silence. The effect was disorienting, maddening, deliberate. Many cried, some screamed. One man clawed at the walls until his fingernails tore, but the silence never stopped. When the trial ended, the lamb would be given 3 choices: stay and serve, leave and forget, or die and cleanse. Most chose to stay. Those who left were followed for a time, observed, studied, weighed for threat. A few never made it past the next trail crossing. Those who stayed were reborn, their names changed, their pasts buried. They became servants of the flame, the inner ring. These men didn't just obey, they believed, and that belief became weaponized. Servants were assigned missions, not murder, not at first. Influence, seduction, doubt. One was sent to a small town to marry the daughter of a prominent judge. Another joined a trade caravan bound for California, tasked with establishing a foothold among traveling merchants. Each assignment had a goal: spread the doctrine without ever naming it. Use fear, use desire, use loss, whatever cracked the shell. Morai taught them that ideas are blades, and the sharpest ones leave no wound. By the end of 1869, the order had 14 servants in the field. No titles, no uniforms, only intent. They could be anywhere. A preacher, a teacher, a grieving widower. The lambs had grown fangs, and the silence was no longer confined to the chapel. It was walking among the people. By the winter of 1870, the Graysons understood something that few institutions, religious or otherwise, ever dared to admit. The most effective way to control a man is not through fear, but through meaning. A man will resist pain. He will fight against chains. But if you convince him that his suffering serves a sacred purpose, that obedience earns him a place in eternity, he will kneel willingly and never rise again. And so, the order ceased operating like a mere family cult and began transforming into something far more insidious, a machine for psychological conversion. The rituals grew more elaborate, not louder, deeper. Silence became sacrament. Every Sunday, the chapel conducted a ceremony called the Still Hour. No words were spoken, only gestures, a nod, a kneel, a hand placed over the heart. The purpose was simple: to dissolve the self, strip away ego, make each man feel not like an individual but a vessel. The deeper the stillness, the greater the connection. Morai preached that language was a corruption, that the devil entered through careless speech. God speaks in symbols, he wrote. The serpent hisses, the soul listens. It wasn't just theology, it was conditioning. Men learned to obey without instruction, to interpret glances as commands, to feel guilt without rebuke. They stopped asking why, and that was the goal. The trial of 3 days had filtered the emotional weaklings, but the still hour broke the intellectual ones, and in their place it forged a terrible kind of purity, one that did not question, only executed. Jonah, now fully in charge of internal affairs, began recording the rituals, not just their structure, but their psychological effects. How long before a man wept in silence? How many weeks before he stopped responding to his birth name? They called it refinement, but it was closer to erasure. And yet the erased were content, smiling, calm, deed behind the eyes, but obedient to the end. These weren't killers, they were instruments. Some were sent out with messages, others tasked with following targets. A few were buried, alive, in coffins for 24 hours, then exhumed, rebaptized, and renamed. When they returned to the surface, they no longer feared death. And that, Morai believed, was true power. Not control over life, but control over what a man believes his life means. That's what made them unstoppable. By 1871, the order no longer needed to lure families into the chapel. They had become the ones sent for. Fires, droughts, epidemics. The Graysons knew that chaos softened the soil of the human mind. So they expanded not by force, but by offering help in places where no help remained. When a smallpox outbreak decimated a mining town in southern Idaho, it was Brother Caleb who arrived with carts of herbal remedies and a handwritten letter from a fictitious Christian medical guild. He never claimed to be a healer. He let others draw that conclusion. Within 2 weeks, he was feeding the sick, burying the dead, and whispering prayers over fevered heads. What those people didn't know was that half the tinctures Caleb distributed were laced with low doses of belladonna and ergot, drugs that disoriented, inspired visions, and made the desperate believe they were seeing angels. Caleb documented everything. How quickly they cried, who touched his hand and begged for forgiveness. Which of them could be approached again when their minds were pliable? He sent his reports back to Jonah, who catalogued each one under coded names: Red Harvest, Pale Daughters, Ashes to Salt. These weren't medical missions, they were psychological trials, and they worked. From that point on, the order embedded itself into every local disaster it could access: flooded towns, burned down churches, orphanages struck by cholera. They arrived as volunteers, but always left with more than they brought. Not just money or artifacts, but people. Survivors whose minds had been shaped by loss, primed for doctrine. Some were taken back to Oregon. Others were left behind as sleepers, unaware of their future purpose until the right letter or phrase activated them. This was Morai's genius. He didn't need to create tragedy, he just needed to harvest it. America was fertile with pain. The Civil War had left men shattered, their faith broken. Westward expansion had scattered communities and killed traditions. Every town was a wound, and Morai saw himself as the surgeon, or the maggot, feeding, cleaning, clearing the rot. The order began acquiring land, small plots around abandoned churches, way stations, even cemeteries, places no one visited, places that could store the dead, hide the living, or host the next ritual. The chapel was no longer the center, the entire western frontier was. By the spring of 1872, the order no longer operated in the shadows. They had become the architects of the shadows. Their network extended through trade routes, church pulpits, and benevolent societies that masked something far older and colder than compassion. Morai understood that most men don't recognize evil when it wears their uniform, speaks their scripture, and volunteers at their soup kitchens. So he created a program called the Communion of Roads, a traveling ministry that claimed to support frontier missionaries and provide aid to isolated parishes. In reality, it was a front. Wagons painted with holy verses carried not just food and supplies, but encrypted documents, poisons, forged identities, and tools for quiet elimination. These missionaries were all servants, men who had passed the trial, received their silence, and buried their pasts. Each was given a new name and a sacred objective: to infiltrate communities, identify fault lines, and begin the slow corrosion of trust. Their methods varied. Some embedded themselves in town councils, others became Sunday school teachers, barbers, apothecaries, professions that touched many lives without attracting suspicion. They offered help, not heresy. They quoted scripture, not manifestos. And slowly, without notice, they shifted how people thought. They seeded doubts about their neighbors, whispered suggestions about hidden sins. They encouraged private confessions, then used that information to manipulate or blackmail. In one Illinois town, a servant convinced an entire congregation that their pastor had been seduced by the devil. Within weeks, the man had been tarred and run out. The replacement? A quiet, kind-faced man who had studied under Father Morai. That pattern repeated itself across counties, then states, always under the guise of moral purification, always wrapped in the cloth of piety. Meanwhile, Joe Nah continued compiling the Doctrine of Silence, now a leather-bound volume known only as the Grey Book. It contained lessons from the field, failures dissected, methods updated. New servants were trained using its contents. It taught them how to identify fractures in a family, how to break loyalty between friends, how to make a man confess what he didn't know he believed. This wasn't murder anymore. It was indoctrination through misdirection, and it was working. By the end of 1872, the order had active cells in 13 states. Not one of them had been exposed, because the order didn't fight power. It became power, quietly, patiently, permanently. By 1873, Father Morai and Sister Constance had come to a chilling realization. True legacy was not built on ideas alone, but on blood. If the order was to endure beyond their lifespans, it needed not just followers, but heirs. Not just believers, but children raised in silence, baptized in obedience, and conditioned from birth to never question their purpose. The shift began quietly. Servants were instructed to marry, not for love, but for utility. Wives were chosen not from within the order, but from vulnerable communities. War widows, orphaned daughters of pastors, women whose trauma made them pliable. These women were shown kindness, protection, and purpose. In time, they became loyal, not just to their husbands, but to the silent creed. Their children, the first true-born generation of the order, were called the seeded. These were not ordinary children. From infancy, they were raised with sensory control, periods of absolute silence, deprivation rituals, and symbolic immersion. Their first words were not mother or father, but verses from the Grey Book. They were never told about the outside world except in terms of its filth, its corruption, its blindness. To them, the order was not a cult, it was reality. One boy named Elias, born in 1874, was documented in Jonah's personal journal as the most promising seeded asset. By the age of 6, he could recite all 121 parables of silence and name every servant who had died in the cause. At 7, he spent 3 days buried in a mock grave, alone in the cold earth, with only the echo of ritual scripture piped in through a breathing tube. He emerged smiling, calm, and unafraid. At 10, he orchestrated the quiet expulsion of a schoolteacher in Missouri by planting fabricated rumors of indecency, then offering his own father, an order servant, as the moral replacement. These children were bred for quiet dominance, their minds shaped like clay, their bodies trained for patience and subtlety. They didn't scream, they didn't cry, they obeyed. And most terrifying of all, they believed. By 1880, nearly 60 seeded children existed across 7 states, each placed strategically in schools, churches, and farms. The order didn't just have soldiers, it had successors, and unlike converts, these ones wouldn't have to be convinced. They had never known anything else. Silence wasn't their doctrine, it was their first language. By the winter of 1874, the order had moved beyond infiltration. It had mastered psychological infection. No longer content with harvesting chaos, they began manufacturing it. Their strategy evolved into a form of invisible warfare, one that didn't rely on armies, weapons, or violence in the traditional sense. Instead, they weaponized perception, trust, memory. Servants were instructed to enter rural towns and begin spreading carefully crafted rumors, subtle, slow-burning narratives designed to corrode relationships, fracture congregations, and stir doubt. A husband whispered to question his wife's fidelity. A child told that their teacher harbored unholy thoughts. A respected shopkeeper accused, anonymously, of withholding tithes from the church. No proof, just suggestions. Suspicion did the rest. The order didn't need to destroy people directly, it needed only to make them destroy each other, and they did. Towns began to unravel, not with screams, but with silence. Friends stopped visiting each other, churches split, sheriffs began to drink more heavily, preachers gave darker sermons. The order watched and took notes. These campaigns were called cycles of division, and each was documented in the Gray Book with clinical detachment. One town in eastern Kansas disintegrated completely after a 3-month campaign. It started with a rumor about poisoned communion wine. Within weeks, 3 families had fled. 2 men were dead in a double murder-suicide, and the town's only chapel was burned to the ground. The servant responsible for the campaign received a new name, Thorn, and was reassigned to Arkansas. He was 16 years old. That was the power of the order, not brute force, but intimate knowledge of human weakness. They understood that the average man feared being alone, feared being wrong, and feared being judged. So the order gave them something worse, uncertainty. If you can make a man question what he sees, what he hears, what he remembers, he will beg for guidance. And that's when the order arrives, not as tyrants, but as saviors. They don't shout, they whisper, they nod, they hand you a book that explains the pain, a new truth, a cleaner version of reality. And once you accept it, you'll never look at your wife, your children, your pastor the same way again. That's the brilliance. The order never breaks you, you break yourself. They just hand you the hammer. By 1876, the order's influence had outgrown the frontier. It no longer sought just the desperate or the dying, it sought permanence, and permanence required institutions. So they turned their gaze toward 3 pillars: education, law, and medicine. The decision wasn't arbitrary. Morai understood that if you shape how children learn, how justice is defined, and how bodies are healed, you control the present, the future, and the soul. Their approach, as always, was subtle. Servants began securing positions as teachers in remote schoolhouses, particularly in underfunded counties where oversight was minimal. There, they rewrote history, not blatantly, but surgically. They emphasized obedience, punished critical thinking, and taught alternate versions of scripture that merged morality with silence. Children who asked too many questions were isolated. Those who conformed were rewarded with secrets, rituals, and symbols passed down as special knowledge. These weren't lessons, they were grooming sessions. At the same time, the order infiltrated rural sheriff's offices and circuit courts by placing sympathetic men in low-level positions: clerks, deputies, record keepers. Over time, those men climbed the ranks or influenced those who did. Arrest records disappeared. Deaths went uninvestigated. Property was quietly seized. Witnesses were discredited using methods from the Gray Book. False accusations, public shaming, isolation. Justice became malleable. The 3rd pillar, medicine, was perhaps their most powerful. Sister Constance's legacy lived on through female operatives who posed as midwives, nurses, and traveling herbalists. They operated in areas where official doctors were few, and desperation made their patients compliant. Through these roles, they administered selective care, healing those useful to the order, and quietly eliminating those who asked too much. But more than that, they conducted experiments, dosages, psychological thresholds, childbirth rituals. They tracked which compounds altered memory, which incited visions, which erased weeks of cognition. These were not caregivers, they were field researchers, and their findings were sent back to a growing archive beneath the chapel, now referred to as the root cellar, a name whispered by only the oldest servants. The Order's methods didn't rely on domination. They relied on patience. They didn't overthrow governments. They outlived them. By 1880, several counties across Oregon, Kansas, and Missouri had unknowingly passed through what Jonah called full infection, when a town's school, court, and clinic all carried the Order's fingerprints. No resistance, no uprising, just the quiet fall of light into shadow. By 1881, the Order had mastered an even deeper truth. Grief was the most fertile soil for control. Where others saw tragedy, they saw opportunity. Where death left holes, they planted scripture. When the scarlet fever epidemic swept across the Midwest, killing thousands, the Order dispatched its midwives and missionaries to comfort the bereaved. They didn't bring medicine, they brought meaning. They whispered to mourning mothers that their children's deaths were not random, but a sacred exchange. A purification. They told grieving fathers that the world had grown too loud and that silence was the only way to prevent further suffering. They offered scripture, candles, rituals, not to cure the wound, but to reshape it into something sacred, something the Order could own. In towns ravaged by disease, the servants arrived too late to save, but always just in time to reframe. They organized night vigils under the guise of healing ceremonies, but instead, they inducted. Grieving families were told their sorrow was proof of calling, that only the chosen suffer like this, that the dead were not lost but harvested. And the most effective converts came not from the firebrands or the lonely, but from those with fresh graves and nowhere else to turn. The Order also turned its gaze toward the fallout of war. Though the Civil War had ended more than a decade prior, the human wreckage remained. Widows, amputees, fatherless children, the kinds of people who fell through the cracks of society. These weren't just stragglers to the Order, they were blank slates. Men who had seen the worst of humanity were easily convinced that silence was the only true peace. Women left abandoned were flattered, then claimed. Their children were baptized into the Order without ever knowing another doctrine. Whole families, shattered by war and plague, were quietly rebuilt, not with love, but with obedience. Not with healing, but with structure. These weren't acts of charity, they were conversions disguised as kindness. And it worked. By 1883, the Order had influence in more than 50 communities across 7 states, with over 400 members actively embedded in social and religious roles. No one knew their full scale because no one could track what didn't scream, didn't march, didn't demand. It whispered, wept, and waited. Grief had made them invisible, and invisibility was power. By 1884, the Order no longer relied solely on converts. They began cultivating successors. They understood that true continuity demanded children born into silence, not just recruited from it. The Grayson legacy shifted from survival to succession. It began with the orphans, those left behind by disease, war, or Order-induced tragedy. These children were taken in not as charity cases, but as vessels. Raised within secluded learning houses, they were taught to read, not with stories, but with ciphers. Their textbooks were handwritten manuals of obedience, history rewritten to emphasize divine silence and the sanctity of secrecy. These were not schools, they were hatcheries, and within them, the next generation of servants was molded. They were denied surnames, names were earned, not given. Identity came only through obedience and ritual performance. Each child was required to memorize the Grey Book's foundational 72 verses, coded doctrines written in layered symbolism, designed to be interpreted only through Order-led instruction. They were taught to write without speaking, to speak without emotion, to listen without reacting. Pain was not punished, it was studied. By age 10, they could recite the doctrine of absence, which taught that the greatest truth hides in what is not said. By 12, they could lead burial rites. By 14, they were sent into nearby towns under supervision to observe the noise, as they called the outside world. The training was not brutal, but clinical. Emotions were dissected, dreams recorded, every decision analyzed for purity. If a child wept during a burial exercise, they were given additional silence rituals, hours spent in pitch-black chambers designed to cleanse emotional reaction. The most promising were selected for deeper indoctrination, trained in psychological influence, coded language, and subtle manipulation. They would become future judges, preachers, doctors, and school teachers, not to spread order openly, but to inject it invisibly into every layer of society. The plan was not conquest. It was inheritance. What the Graysons had started with blood, this new generation would continue with words, laws, and structure. The order was no longer dependent on secrecy alone. It was becoming systemic. Like a vine growing beneath floorboards, it would not need to break through. It would simply wait. One day the children raised in silence would stand in positions of power, cloaked in normalcy, and no one would question what they said, because no one remembered what it meant to doubt. By 1885, the order had reached its most insidious frontier, not just control of people or institutions, but memory itself. They realized that history wasn't static. It could be rewritten not with books, but with doubt. Memory, after all, was fragile. It didn't need to be erased, only questioned, and so they turned their doctrine inward. The Grey Book was updated with new verses, ones that taught initiates how to dismantle personal timelines, how to separate feeling from fact, how to edit the past with enough repetition that it no longer resisted. Rituals were designed not just for worship, but for amnesia. At dawn, acolytes would write the story of their lives in sand, only to erase it with their palms before speaking their assigned identities aloud. "You are not what happened," Father Morai once wrote, "you are what remains." Survivors of loss were told that their pain was a distortion sent by the old voice, a term used for the fractured pre-order self. Those who questioned too often were not silenced violently, they were simply reprogrammed. Sent into extended silence chambers, these initiates would spend days with no sound, no light, no names. When they emerged, what they remembered was softer, further away, less dangerous. Entire communities were reshaped through these techniques. Towns where the order had embedded for years began holding monthly remembrance fastings, during which citizens were encouraged to write their worst memories on paper, then burn them together in massive, wordless gatherings. The ashes were considered sacred, mixed into the soil where the next generation's food was grown. "Forget to survive, remember to suffer," became a common phrase whispered at these events. Families no longer spoke of grandparents. Old photographs were deemed excess attachments. Tombstones in order-controlled cemeteries were left intentionally unmarked. Even names of the purgators, dead, were considered burdens. Through this slow erosion, the order rewrote entire narratives, not with violence but with practiced decay, and once a person's memory was hollowed out, they became pliable, willing to follow, to protect, to enforce. In those who had no past, the order could plant any future. This wasn't indoctrination, it was rebirth. A complete death of the inner voice, replaced with the chorus of control. And in time, even the most horrifying truths lost their edge, because they no longer belonged to anyone who remembered them fully. By 1886, the order no longer operated from the margins. It had seeped into the walls of the institutions themselves. No longer content to merely influence broken families or forgotten towns, they began placing their most refined initiates into public office, education boards, county health departments, and judiciary roles. These weren't agents of chaos, they were architects of order. Their job wasn't to spread belief in the Grey Book, it was to shape environments where silence thrived naturally. In schools, order-trained educators quietly removed certain books from libraries, not banned, just misplaced. Lessons on critical thinking were replaced with rote memorization. Children were praised not for asking questions, but for perfect obedience. In local government, order judges began favoring decisions that deferred to majority sentiment rather than objective law. They introduced obscure zoning laws that allowed for the quiet acquisition of land around chapels, orphanages, and cemeteries. Slowly, the map bent in their direction. In county health boards, subtle policies emerged: mandatory silence periods in hospitals, the removal of patient names after death, standardization of burial processes that discouraged personal rituals. These weren't seen as sinister, they were framed as progress, as efficiency. But efficiency is what you strive for when you want no one to linger, when you want the living to forget the dead before they're even gone. By 1888, several towns in eastern Oregon, northern California, and western Idaho were effectively controlled by order-aligned officials, not with guns, not with threats, but with procedures, with paperwork, with norms that no longer felt strange. In one notable case, the town of Hollow Bend voted unanimously to rename all its streets numerically. No more Oak Street, no more Remembrance Road, just numbers, just systems, a town where nothing personal remained. Outsiders rarely noticed. Tourists called it quirky, locals called it tradition. Only the initiated understood. The names had weight, and that weight had to be lifted for true silence to reign. The order didn't preach anymore. It didn't need to. It legislated, it licensed, it educated, and it buried. And in doing so, it created spaces where truth was not contested, because it was never mentioned. Where pain wasn't healed, it was simply filed away. The order had discovered the most terrifying power of all, not to be feared, but to be normal. By 1889, the Grayson order had perfected what it always intended, a system so mundane it disguised its horror as routine. Rituals once cloaked in blood and whispered prayer had become forms, filings, and functions of civic life. Grief became a process, death became a document, and silence, weaponized for decades, was now embedded in policy. Every township touched by the order's influence introduced a 3-day quiet period following a citizen's death. Officially, it was meant to honor the departed by giving families time to reflect privately. But in practice, it delayed autopsies, halted public inquiries, and prevented emotional testimony from interfering with the state's version of truth. Families were discouraged from holding wakes. Instead, a standardized memorial template was issued, listing the deceased's name, date of birth, date of passing, and a single quote from scripture selected by the county. All graves were formatted identically, same stone, same spacing, no personal epitaphs. The official reason? Equality in mourning, but equality in this case was code for erasure. In schools, a new curriculum was quietly rolled out called The Path of Civic Harmony. On the surface, it encouraged discipline, punctuality, and collective responsibility, but woven into the lessons were foundational ideas from the Grey Book. The body is clay, emotion is noise, and history belongs to the living hand. Teachers trained by order affiliates introduced reflective silence before tests, not as mindfulness, but as control. Students who resisted the silence were labeled disharmonic and given corrective periods in isolation rooms, windowless, soundproof chambers where time was marked only by the soft ticking of a metronome. It wasn't punishment, it was procedure. That was the brilliance. The cruelty was never called cruelty. It was regulation, it was structure, it was poli-sci. Slowly, dissent became disorder. Grief became disobedience. Curiosity became a character flaw. And in that world, the order didn't have to spread its gospel. It simply created a society allergic to chaos, and defined chaos as anything too personal, too emotional, too human. The last chapel still bearing the Grayson name was no longer called a church. It had been repurposed into the Bureau of Civil Records, a place where births, deaths, and marriages were processed with identical solemnity. Same desk, same ink, same silence. The sacred had become administrative, and no one noticed the shift because everyone had been trained not to. By the early 1890s, the order no longer needed to manipulate the minds of newcomers because it had begun cultivating generations born inside the machine. Children raised under its doctrine weren't converted, they were constructed. From their first breath, they were measured by silence, by order, by absence. Their lullabies were metronomes. Their first lessons were about stillness. Their first punishments were wordless. There was no rebellion, because rebellion requires contrast, and they had never tasted noise. Their parents, once victims of subtle indoctrination, had become its stewards, not out of malice but routine, not out of belief but inheritance. The Grayson legacy, once driven by profit and blood, now moved through something more powerful: time. It was no longer about killing families, it was about shaping them from birth, molding entire bloodlines into instruments of stillness. And it worked. Across counties once steeped in chaos, statistics began to shift. Crime rates dropped, school performance rose, mental illness officially declined. But only because no one reported pain anymore. Not out of fear, but conditioning. To speak of despair was to draw attention. To draw attention was to disrupt the system, and disruption, they were taught, was violence. Even the language changed. Words like freedom, memory, and mourning were replaced with terms like alignment, continuity, and release. Vocabulary itself was cleansed, reduced to functional, acceptable phrases that moved conversation but never provoked it. Cemeteries filled quietly, children graduated without asking who they were. Weddings became silent rituals, vows signed, not spoken, and funerals. They weren't funerals, they were closures. 15-minute proceedings with no tears, no eulogies, no music, just names typed into a register and archived without ceremony. The order didn't need to evangelize, and it had encoded itself into time, into routine, into generational inheritance. The descendants of the first victims were now its most loyal enforcers, not through belief, but absence. The absence of contrast, the absence of alternative. They had never known another rhythm. This was the perfection of psychological control, not to shackle the mind, but to remove the memory of freedom altogether. What began as arsenic in tea became a ritual of paperwork, became a silence in the womb. And in the echo of that silence, the Grayson order found its immortality, not in blood but in rhythm, not in death, but in engineered obedience passed like DNA. In the fall of 1893, something shifted, not within the order, but outside it, a foreign element that did not belong to the rhythm, a man named Elias Vexley, whose arrival in the town of Hollow Bend was marked not by a proclamation, but by a question. He didn't come with banners or rebellion. He came with eyes that had seen war and a silence of his own, forged not by doctrine, but by trauma. A former surveyor and Civil War veteran, Elias had been contracted by the state to update territorial boundary maps and inspect the region's rapidly expanding civil infrastructure. On paper, he was harmless, just another bureaucrat with a clipboard and compass. But unlike those raised under the order's gaze, Elias recognized what others didn't: absence. There were no old grave markers, no historical plaques, no oral histories. The town had people, but no past. Every record he reviewed, from marriage licenses to land deeds, felt clean, too clean, like they had been rewritten recently, all bearing the same handwriting styles, the same phrases. Even the land itself seemed cautious, as if conditioned to hide. When Elias asked about the town's founding families, he was met with polite deflections and vacant smiles. No one remembered anything beyond their own generation. "We don't dwell," said one town clerk, as if it were policy. "We proceed." That phrase haunted Elias. He heard it again from a schoolteacher, from a physician, even from a child. We proceed. A mantra of forgetting. It reminded him of something he had seen in southern prison camps during the war, where the worst tortures left no scars, only obedience. But it wasn't until he entered the old chapel, now the Bureau of Civil Records, that he felt the air shift. Beneath the bureaucratic facade, the architecture whispered. The grain of the wood, the slope of the beams, the alignment of the altar, none of it matched civic design. It was ceremonial, ritualistic. And behind a false wall in the basement, he found what no one else was supposed to. A ledger, faded, brittle, marked in a careful hand. The name Morrison appeared first, then Hoffman, then Weatherby. It wasn't a list of citizens, it was a list of the dead, real names, real dates, and real blood. Elias Vexley didn't know it yet, but he had just broken the first seal. Memory had returned, and the order had no defense for memory. Elias Vexley didn't flee, not at first. He was a man shaped by war, loss, and years of wandering through territories haunted by forgotten violence. But even he felt the weight of what he had uncovered. The ledger was more than evidence. It was a graveyard disguised as inventory, a ledger of death dressed in clerical calm. Names, ages, possessions, burial notes, all logged with terrifying precision. And at the bottom of each entry, always the same symbol, a circle enclosing a downward-pointing triangle, the order's seal. That night, Elias took the book back to his rented cabin and lit a fire, not for warmth, but protection. He felt watched, not by a person, but by the silence itself, as if the air had remembered how to listen. At 3:12 a.m., the stillness broke. A knock at his door, calm, measured, one strike every 2 seconds. He didn't answer. The knocking continued for 66 seconds, then stopped. When he opened the door, no one was there. But someone had placed a fresh Bureau of Records envelope on his doorstep. Inside, a letter typed with no return address. Proceed. That single word, printed in perfect alignment, felt more like a commandment than a threat. Elias knew then he had been marked. The next morning his map case had been rifled through, though nothing was stolen. His compass, which he always kept facing true north, now pointed east. Small signs, intentional distortions, meant to unnerve rather than destroy. He wasn't being hunted, he was being disoriented. But Elias had seen psychological warfare before. This was theater, silent intimidation meant to coerce retreat. It only deepened his resolve. He began discreetly copying the ledger, page by page, storing the replicas in 3 separate locations. He mailed one set to a contact in Salem, a retired archivist who owed him a wartime favor. Another he buried beneath a marker stone outside the town's border. The third he hid in plain sight, wrapped in a child's reader and placed in the Hollow Bend Library's return bin. What Elias understood, and what the Order feared, was that truth, once reintroduced into memory, is a contagion. It spreads not through shouting, but whispering. One man alone could not destroy the Grayson legacy, but he could contaminate its silence, and once silence is breached, it cannot be resealed. The fall of the Grayson Order did not begin with fire or fury, it began with doubt. Quiet, creeping, corrosive doubt. A schoolteacher found one of Elias's copied pages misfiled inside a returned library book. She read the names, Morrison, Hoffman, Weatherby, and felt a strange familiarity she couldn't explain. That night, she dreamed of a chapel without windows, of children coughing in the dark. The next morning, she burned her church clothes. Weeks later, the archivist in Salem published an anonymous article in a fringe historical journal titled The Hollow Bend Ledger, Notes on a Forgotten Purge. It was dismissed by academics as fictional, yet something had already shifted. In Hollow Bend, several graves in the old chapel grove were unearthed by accident during a land survey. No one claimed the bones. DNA tests, quietly ordered by out-of-town researchers, revealed multiple victims unrelated to any local bloodline. Still, the town remained silent. It always had. But then came the whispers. A teenager carved the triangle in circle symbol into his desk and was expelled. A woman refused consecrated medicine at the clinic and was denied further treatment. A young boy began drawing detailed diagrams of a basement he had never seen. Memory was surfacing, not through evidence but through blood. The descendants of the murdered were beginning to feel their inheritance, not as grief, but as dissonance. Things didn't add up, stories didn't align, and the phrase, "we proceed," no longer soothed. It stung. By spring, dozens had quietly left Hollow Bend. The Bureau of Records was shuttered without explanation. The chapel-turned office was boarded shut after an internal fire singed its western wall. Exactly where the false ledger chamber had been, no investigation followed, but the legacy did not vanish. You are part of it now. You've heard the names. You've walked through the pattern. And if you've made it this far, there is no going back. You were never meant to know this, but knowing changes you, and silence, once pierced, does not return to stillness. If you understand this, If something inside you has awakened, then leave a comment with the phrase, "The Order remembers me." Write it twice, once for memory, once for identity. The Grayson family may be dust, but their pattern survives in systems that still reward obedience, suppress questions, and weaponize silence. You've seen behind the curtain. Now, act like you never did, or speak like you never forgot.